34 to 37. Jesus went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it. Yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, born in Syria Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. First, let the children eat all they want, he told her, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Lord, she replied, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Then he told her, for such a reply, you may go, the demon has left your daughter. She went home and found her child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee, and into the region of Decapolis. There some people brought him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk. They begged Jesus to place his hands on him. After he took him aside away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers in the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven, and with a deep sigh he said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. At this the man's ears were opened and his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. This is the gospel of Christ.
Praise Christ our Lord.
Familiar with an ancient hymn, perhaps it's the older people who will be more familiar with this. It's written by a man called Henry Twells, and it begins, at even ere the sun was set, the sick, O Lord, around thee lay. Oh, in what divers pains they met, oh, with what joy they went away. His inspiration for writing the hymn, there was the evocative scene painted by St. Luke in his Gospel, where he says, when the sun was setting, the people brought to Jesus all who had various kinds of sickness, and laid his hands on each one and healed them. Then, as we've just heard in today's reading, this time from St. Mark's pen, we heard Jesus at it again. That is, exercising his ministry of healing. And on this occasion, the beneficiaries were a little girl and a deaf man with a speech impediment. But this was not, as we might say, in Jesus' backyard. In fact, he deliberately moved away from Galilee, where he was under constant scrutiny, both from the crowds who turned out to hear him and to receive his ministry of healing, and from the religious authorities who were hell-bent on discrediting him and his ministry. And so he'd gone to the region of Tyre, to the northwest of Galilee, with its predominantly Gentile or Jewish population. There he'd hoped to be unrecognised and could get some rest. But as we heard, there was at least one person, a Syro-Phoenician woman, give her sort of the full title as she described, who had somehow got wind of who Jesus was and his healing powers, and who was determined to ask his help, not for herself, but for her sick daughter. In order to understand their conversation, we need to remember that at this time, in this particular region, there was real hostility between the Jews and the local people. And according to the Jewish historian Josephus, this was caused not least in part by the fact that much of the farming produce of Galilee ended up in Tyre, and neighbouring Sidon. For their part, the Jews needed to protect their food supply against this trade, and hence its unpopularity. And it's been suggested that we need to bear this in mind when we read the verse in our Gospel when Jesus says to the woman, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Out of context, that sounds, if we're honest, at the best abrupt, at worst plain rude, even uncharacteristic of Jesus. But then Jesus was not in his home territory and among those to whom he felt he'd been called to minister. In commenting on this passage, a man called Tim Brewitt, who used to be, if he's not now, I think he used to be the warden down at Lawn Abbey, suggested a possible subtext to Jesus' words. Bearing in mind the economic context, he interprets what Jesus is saying. He says this: "You Tyrians literally take food from the mouths of ordinary Jews to whom God has sent me to minister. What right have you to take their spiritual food too?" Seen in this way, Jesus' words are not so much rude or even racist, but while rather harsh, are challenging. For her part, the woman seems to accept what Jesus says, even the rather abusive Jewish reference to Gentiles as dogs, and possibly being aware of how her fellow citizens regarded and treated Jews. But she's undeterred. Her focus remains, as does her faith in Jesus. She desperately wants him to heal her daughter, like the act of being fed like dogs, with the crumbs of the scraps of their owners' tables. And Jesus responds graciously by granting her request. For saying that, he says, "You may go. The demon has left your daughter." On her arrival home, Mark tells us, she found her daughter lying on her bed and free from torment. Whether it was because the cat was out of the bag, as we might say, as regards locals knowing who he was, or maybe because he'd had his break and was feeling refreshed, we're told that Jesus returned to his Galilean ministry. And no sooner had he arrived than a man was brought to him who was deaf, and possibly because of his deafness also had a speech impediment. Not wishing to make a great show of what he was about to do, Jesus took the man to one side and away from the crowd who had gathered. What he then did was not something we'd expect to see happen in church today, and it may well have been misunderstood by many even at the time. For Jesus, in part, imitated his actions, and his actions in part echoed what would have been used by the magical practitioners within the Greek culture at the time. For in that culture and on the fringe of Judaism, the use of spittle was a means of healing, was well known. Mark tells us that Jesus sticks his fingers into the man's ears. And apparently, the Greek word used here does not imply that he did it gently. He then spits, possibly on his fingers, and places the spittle on the man's tongue. Although the wording here doesn't rule out the possibility of Jesus spitting on the ground or even into the man's mouth. Then we are told Jesus sighed. The word used also possibly translates that he groaned or wailed. Again, a part of the ritual associated with the Greek healers as they tried to gain control over the spiritual powers. But because we don't have any record of specific healing rituals used at the time, it is impossible to say whether Jesus did or did not make use of them. What seems clear, however, is that he seems to be working within the culture of his day. And in this case, it clearly worked. Whether it was for the first time or once again, the man was able to hear and to speak clearly. As happened time and again, as people listened to and watched Jesus at work, The crowd, we are told, was astonished. A more modern word might be to say he was gobsmacked. They were gobsmacked. And who wouldn't be at the things that Jesus was getting up to and doing? But of course, while in these two different instances, the word healing is clearly interchangeable with the word cured, it's not always so. For God's work of healing or making whole, as demonstrated by Jesus during his earthly ministry, clearly can result in being cured of a particular illness, but it doesn't have to be that way. For wholeness, in the eyes of God, is possible despite of, maybe in some cases because of, say, a disability, and can even be present at a deathbed. Think of the Paralympians. I think it's the last day today, isn't it, of those sports. It's a fact, as I heard one of the athletes admit, and as crazy as it may sound, that in some, if not many cases, they would not achieve what they're able to do if they were able-bodied. And no more is God's gift of wholeness dependent solely on our bodies and even our minds being in perfect working order. For God sees us from the inside, not simply the outside. If he is able to heal, that is to make whole, above all by bringing us into the right relationship with himself, then we have all that we may need. And ironically, of course, the Jesus healing ministry demonstrated, if that all-important relationship is made, then physical and mental healing, in the sense of being cured, can also result. Neil, or to give him his full name, Neil Broadbent, as far as I know, is still active in this ministry, but he's a Church of England priest who exercises a very special ministry of healing. I met him now a number of years ago, and looking in my Crockford's Directory of Clergy, I see he's still around. In a very low key, and yet a very powerful way, at his base, it's an old vicarage in southeast Derbyshire, but also when he's out on the road, and I remember seeing him arrive on his huge motorbike, he reaches out in our Lord's name to those who are in any way diseased, and for that person. All I know is that something always happens. God touches them in a life-enhancing, a life-giving way. In the parish where I was rector at the time, in fact the time I met Neil, was a man. He was in our church choir, a wonderful man. He ran one of the local, I think it was a hardware store, or at least went in his working days. It's also he had a wonderful deep voice. I can hear him now going out to the vestry, singing the first hymn, processing in. I think many of us will remember Paul Robeson and that deep, deep voice. And it was just like that. Frank had a wonderful voice. But on this occasion, Frank's life was coming to an end. He was actually dying. He was at home. Neil came to visit us as a parish. He was going to talk to a group of us about the ministry of healing. But Frank asked if it would be possible for him to arrive a little bit early, go to his house and meet with him, which Neil clearly was welcome, happy to do so. And they spent, I think it was about half an hour together. That night, Frank died. And his wife Isabel told me that it was a wonderful death. Sounds odd, doesn't it? But the fact is that having been ministered to by Neil, it completely washed away, if you like, any anxiety, any fear that Frank had. In fact, he died, as his wife described, full of joy and at peace. A joy and a peace that was God's wonderful gift to Frank. A gift of wholeness.